I always believed that a wedding should be about love, about new beginnings. That's what I told myself when I stood at the mirror, adjusting the delicate pearl necklace that my daughter Rachel had chosen for me. She wanted everything to be perfect for her big day. Every detail planned down to the last flower petal. And it would be perfect if not for one looming issue. Her father, Daniel. The moment I thought of him, my reflection soured. The tension in my jaw tightened as I smoothed out the lace of my navy blue dress, the one I had chosen specifically because it exuded elegance and grace, qualities Daniel had always said I lacked. I could already picture his brooding presence, his disapproving eyes scanning the lavish ballroom like it was some unnecessary extravagance. He had fought me on everything leading up to this day, on the venue, the guest list, even the choice to have an open bar. Rachel doesn't need a wedding this expensive, he'd said weeks before, shaking his head in that exasperating way of his. She just needs family and friends. As if money didn't matter. As if she didn't deserve the best. Of course, I didn't argue with him. There was no point anymore. Daniel had become a man who clung to his outdated principles like they were his last lifeline. He despised the idea of luxury, of indulging. He had always been practical, too practical. It's what had drawn me to him in the beginning, back when I thought stability meant happiness. But over the years, that practicality turned into something else, something suffocating. While Rachel and I planned the wedding of her dreams, Daniel had become distant, almost indifferent. It was as if he saw her happiness as an inconvenience. Even on this morning, he hadn't even sent her a message. Not a single word of encouragement. I sighed, glancing at the clock. The ceremony was just hours away. Outside my hotel suite, voices filled the hallway. Rachel's bridesmaids giggling, guests shuffling from their rooms, the hum of last-minute preparations. And somewhere down the hall there was Todd. Todd with his easy charm and warm eyes. Todd, who had walked into my life when I least expected it. A knock at the door startled me. I turned just as Todd slipped inside, flashing that familiar, knowing smile. "How's the bride?" he asked, closing the door softly behind him. "Nervous," I admitted, smoothing my hands over my dress again. "But happy." He stepped closer, his gaze lingering on me. "And the mother of the bride?" I hesitated before answering. "I just want today to go smoothly." Todd tilted his head, sensing what I wasn't saying. He had a way of reading between the lines, something Daniel never bothered to do. "You're worried about him," Todd murmured. I swallowed, glancing at my reflection again. "Daniel's been difficult." Todd scoffed, his expression darkening. "Difficult is an understatement. The man acts like this wedding is some personal attack." I let out a small, humorless laugh. It wouldn't surprise me if he found a way to make today about himself. Todd placed a reassuring hand on my shoulder. "You don't owe him anything, Emily. He's had years to appreciate you, to appreciate Rachel. If he didn't want to be part of this, that's on him." I nodded, though my stomach twisted with unease. I had told myself the same thing many times, but deep down I still expected Daniel to do something, anything to make a scene today. He was a man who didn't handle rejection well. And in a way that's exactly what today was. Rachel had made it clear. She wanted Todd to walk her down the aisle. At first I had tried to convince her otherwise. Felt too drastic, too cruel. But Rachel had been firm. "Dad hasn't been there for me in years, Mom," she had said, frustration lacing her voice. "I need someone who actually supports me. Someone who doesn't make me feel like a burden." I had no response to that. Because in the end she was right. Daniel had become so consumed with his own pride, his own discontent, that he had stopped being the father she needed. And that's why, when the wedding coordinator handed me the final schedule, I didn't even blink when I saw Daniel's name missing from every major moment of the ceremony. No father-daughter dance. No speech. No walking Rachel down the aisle. He was just another guest now. I told myself he had done this to himself. The ceremony began in a golden blur of sunlight filtering through cathedral windows. Rachel looked breathtaking in her gown, her smile so full of life as she walked toward Todd, who beamed with pride as he took her arm. I watched from the front row, my heart swelling. But as my eyes drifted across the crowd, they landed on Daniel. He sat stiffly in the pew, his expression unreadable, his hands clasped together tightly in his lap. I couldn't tell if he was furious or just empty. For a brief second, guilt flickered inside me, and then just as quickly it disappeared. Because when the priest asked, "Who gives this woman away?" Todd answered confidently, "I do." "And Daniel?" He stayed silent. I expected a reaction from Daniel. A tightening of his jaw, a stiff shift in his seat, maybe even a bitter exhale as Todd proudly gave Rachel away. But he did nothing. He just sat there, hands clasped together, his expression unreadable. For a moment I thought he might stand up, object cause a scene in front of all these people. That's the kind of thing Daniel would have done years ago. But instead he simply watched like a man staring at something that no longer belonged to him. Rachel didn't spare him a glance. She had made her decision weeks ago, when she chose Todd to take his place. The ceremony moved on in a perfect haze, vows exchanged, rings slipped onto fingers, the whispered promises of forever. I should have been focused on the moment, on my daughter stepping into a new life, but part of me kept flickering back to Daniel. I wasn't sure what I had expected him to do. I thought back to the night Rachel made her choice. We had been sitting at the kitchen table, the wedding planning binder open between us when she said it. "I want Todd to walk me down the aisle." I remember blinking at her, my stomach twisting. "Rachel, your father hasn't been a real father in years," she finished sharply. "Not in the way that counts." I had sighed, rubbing my temples. "Sweetheart, this is going to hurt him." Rachel scoffed, shaking her head. "When has he ever cared if he hurt me?" And that was that. Daniel hadn't argued when I broke the news to him. He didn't fight it, didn't try to change her mind. He just shut down. That had been weeks ago, but now, watching him in that church, I could tell something inside him had broken. He didn't clap when Rachel and Jason were pronounced husband and wife. He didn't smile when she threw her bouquet, and he didn't even pretend to be engaged when the photographer called for a family picture. "Come on, folks, let's get the bride's parents in here." I stood beside Rachel, resting my hand on her back, as Todd placed a steadying arm around my waist. Daniel hesitated before moving toward us, stepping into the shot like a man being forced into a prison lineup. The photographer gave a cheerful thumbs up. "All right, big smiles everyone." Rachel's face lit up, her joy so genuine it softened the sharp angles of my guilt. Todd grinned as if he had always been part of this family. And Daniel? Daniel just looked hollow. The flash went off. It was over in seconds, but the discomfort lingered, thick and heavy. The ballroom was filled with laughter and clinking glasses, the scent of champagne and roses weaving through the air. I sat beside Todd at the head table, watching as Rachel and Jason swayed on the dance floor, lost in their own world. I caught sight of Daniel near the bar, nursing a drink. He hadn't spoken to me all evening. I hadn't gone out of my way to speak to him either. He looked out of place, like a man who had shown up at a stranger's wedding by mistake. "Are you going to check on him?" Todd asked beside me, his voice low. I sighed, tracing the rim of my glass with my finger. "I don't know if he wants me to." Todd let out a quiet chuckle. "I don't think he wants to be here at all." I frowned. "He's here for Rachel." "Rachel hasn't spoken to him once tonight," Todd pointed out. "I don't think she wants him here either." I turned back toward the dance floor. It was true. Rachel had gone out of her way to avoid him. She laughed with guests, clinked glasses, danced with Jason's father, but she hadn't acknowledged Daniel once. I almost felt sorry for him. Almost. Then came the father-daughter dance. Well, technically the stepfather-daughter dance. The DJ's voice boomed through the speakers. "Ladies and gentlemen, let's welcome the bride and her father figure to the dance floor." Rachel's eyes found Todd's. She beamed, grabbing his hand as they made their way forward. The crowd clapped and I felt warmth spread through my chest as I watched Todd take her into his arms. And Daniel? He was still by the bar. For a brief second I thought he might walk out. I could see it in the way he shifted his weight, in the way his hand curled into a fist. But he didn't move. He just stood there, watching. And when the music began to play, he turned his back. I knew then that something inside him had shattered completely. Later that night, after the cake had been cut and the guests had begun to filter out, I finally approached him. I found him on the balcony, staring out at the city lights, his drink untouched in his hand. "You haven't said much tonight," I said softly. Daniel let out a humorless laugh. "Not much to say." I folded my arms. Rachel was happy today. She was, he agreed. His voice was eerily calm. I hesitated. Are you okay? He turned to look at me, then really look at me, and for the first time I saw something in his eyes that sent a shiver down my spine. I should have left earlier, he said, almost to himself. I frowned. What does that mean? Daniel smiled, but there was no warmth in it. You'll see soon enough. And then, without another word, he walked past me, disappearing into the night. The morning after Rachel's wedding should have been peaceful. It should have been filled with laughter, with stories about the night before, with the usual post-wedding glow that lingers in the air after such a perfect celebration. Instead, the house felt off. I woke up to an eerie silence. No clatter of coffee cups, no shuffling of dress shoes, no quiet murmuring of Rachel reminiscing about her big day. Just stillness. Todd was still asleep beside me, his breathing steady, one arm draped lazily across my waist. I glanced at the clock. 8:12 a.m. I had expected Daniel to leave town immediately after the wedding, maybe send a half-hearted text to Rachel before disappearing back into his miserable little world. But something about the way he had looked at me last night, his cryptic words, the finality in his tone, made me uneasy. I slipped out of bed, wrapping myself in a robe before heading downstairs. Rachel was already awake, sitting at the kitchen island with a steaming mug of coffee, her phone in her hand. Morning, sweetheart, I greeted, walking over to kiss the top of her head. She barely acknowledged me, eyes glued to the screen. I caught a glimpse of her inbox, dozens of missed messages, most of them unopened. Everything okay? I asked, pouring myself a cup of coffee. Rachel exhaled sharply, placing the phone down with a little too much force. Dad left. I blinked. What do you mean he left? She turned to me, her expression unreadable. Like left? For good. I woke up to a message from him saying he's gone, and that I shouldn't try to contact him. I hesitated, sipping my coffee to hide my reaction. I mean, you expected him to leave, didn't you? He wasn't exactly the life of the party last night. Rachel frowned. Yeah, but this feels different. I furrowed my brow. Different how? She shook her head, staring at the screen. I don't know. It just doesn't sound like him. I sighed, setting my mug down. Sweetheart, you made it very clear to him that you didn't want him involved in your wedding. Maybe he's just giving you the space you asked for. Rachel didn't respond right away. She just scrolled through her phone, flipping through the messages, her frown deepening. Finally, she said, Mom, his bank account is empty. I froze. What? She turned the screen toward me, showing an email notification. An alert from Daniel's bank. She must still have access to the online statements from when she used to handle small finances for him. It wasn't just empty. It was closed. Everything. His savings, his checking, even his investment accounts. Gone. A strange unease crept over me. Maybe he transferred it to another bank. Rachel shook her head. I checked. He liquidated everything. I sat down beside her, my mind racing. Daniel was careful with money. Almost obsessive. He hated spending on things he deemed unnecessary, which to him included almost anything remotely enjoyable. For him to suddenly wipe everything out? That wasn't just strange. It was calculated. Rachel's voice cut through my thoughts. That's not all. I looked at her, and she turned the phone back toward herself, scrolling again before stopping at another message. My apartment's rent is unpaid. My stomach twisted. What? Rachel ran a hand through her hair, clearly growing more frustrated. Dad was covering half my rent until Jason and I officially moved in together. It was our agreement. But I just checked my rental portal. He canceled the autopay last week. I sat there, gripping my coffee cup, trying to process everything. Daniel had left. Daniel had drained his accounts. Daniel had stopped supporting Rachel overnight. And suddenly I remembered his words from last night. I should have left earlier. He hadn't just left. He had removed himself from everything. To be why the time Todd came downstairs, Rachel and I had already gone down the rabbit hole of discovering just how deep this went. Daniel hadn't just pulled back on Rachel's rent. He had cut off everything. His credit cards, closed. His health insurance, canceled. Even his old emergency contacts for Rachel's bank account, removed. It was as if he had erased himself from our lives entirely. Not out of sorrow, but out of something else. Something colder. Todd wrapped an arm around me, leaning down to kiss my cheek. Morning, ladies. Why do you both look like you saw a ghost? Rachel rubbed her temples. Dad pulled some kind of disappearing act. Todd arched a brow. What? I filled him in, explaining every little detail we had uncovered in the last hour. By the end, Todd let out a low whistle. So he's really gone? Rachel let out a bitter laugh. Guess so. Todd took a sip of my coffee. Well, isn't that a good thing? Rachel looked at him sharply. Todd shrugged. I mean, you didn't want him at the wedding. You didn't want him in your life. Seems like he got the message. Rachel stared at him for a long moment before turning to me. I didn't think he'd actually leave, she muttered. I sighed, rubbing her arm. Sweetheart, maybe it's for the best. You're starting your new life with Jason. You don't need to be worrying about your father's drama. She nodded, but I could tell she wasn't convinced. I wasn't either, because something about this didn't feel like Daniel running away. It felt like Daniel had planned this. By the afternoon, we had put Daniel's absence on the back burner. Rachel and Jason had checked out of the hotel and were preparing to leave for their honeymoon. Todd and I had gone back home, ready to relax after the chaos of the wedding. And then the call came. It was from the venue. I answered cheerfully, still riding the high of the beautiful night before. Emily Harmon speaking. There was a pause before the woman on the other end cleared her throat. Hi, Mrs. Harmon. I was just calling because we noticed there was an issue with the final payment for the wedding venue. I frowned. Excuse me. Another pause. The payment, it was reversed this morning. The coffee cup nearly slipped from my hands. I'm sorry, what? The woman hesitated before saying, Mr. Daniel Harmon's payment was the one that was declined. He was the primary name on the contract. It seems like the account linked to the payment no longer exists. My heart stopped. No, that was impossible. Daniel had promised to handle the final payment. And if his account was closed, a slow, horrifying realization began to crawl through my body. He had done this on purpose. Daniel had left, all right. And he had taken every last cent with him. That I gripped my phone so tightly I thought it might crack. The words from the venue manager echoed in my ears, sinking in like slow poison. Mr. Daniel Harmon's payment was the one that was declined. It seems like the account linked to the payment no longer exists. Daniel had always been a man of his word. He never made promises he couldn't keep. If anything, he prided himself on his reliability. But now he had done something unthinkable. He had walked away. And worse, he had taken the money with him. Mrs. Harmon? The woman's voice on the other end of the line was cautious, hesitant. I swallowed, forcing my voice to stay level. What exactly does that mean for us? Well, she said slowly, since the payment didn't go through, the balance is still due. Unfortunately, that means the remaining cost of the venue is now your responsibility. I felt a sharp pang in my chest. And how much exactly are we talking about? Another pause. $42,600. My breath caught in my throat. Todd, who had been watching me from across the kitchen, noticed the way my face fell. He set down his coffee and walked over. Emily? What's wrong? But I couldn't answer. I could barely think. $42,600. That was the final amount Daniel was supposed to cover. The part he had assured me he would handle months ago. And now he was gone. I ended the call as politely as I could, promising that I would figure out a way to take care of the balance soon. But the moment I hung up, the panic hit me full force. My hands were shaking. My heart pounded against my ribs. Emily, Todd pressed. Talk to me. What's going on? I looked at him, the words catching in my throat. But there was no hiding this. Daniel never paid for the venue, I whispered. He was supposed to cover the final cost, but his account is closed. The payment got declined. They want the full balance from us. Todd blinked. How much? I swallowed hard. Over 40 grand. His reaction was instant. You've got to be kidding me. I wished I was. Rachel and Jason had already left for their honeymoon. I didn't want to call and dump this on them, but there was no avoiding it. Daniel had stuck us with the bill. Todd ran a hand through his hair, pacing the kitchen. That son of a... He stopped himself, exhaling sharply. I knew something was off when he walked away last night. He planned this. He's been planning this for weeks. I sat down heavily in one of the chairs, my head spinning. What do we do? Todd scoffed. What do we do? We find out where that coward ran off to and make him fix this. But I knew deep down that wasn't an option. Daniel wasn't coming back. He had cut ties with everything, his accounts, his responsibilities, even his own daughter. This wasn't just a man who had left town in anger. This was a man who had erased himself from our lives. By midday, I had already made several desperate calls. First, to Daniel's old workplace. They had no record of him anymore. Then to our family lawyer. No divorce proceedings had been filed, but Daniel had recently requested documents about asset liquidation. And then to his old friend Mark, who had known him since college. Emily. Mark sounded surprised to hear from me. Everything okay? I cut straight to the point. Have you spoken to Daniel? A long pause. Not in a while. Why? I hesitated. He left. Closed his accounts. Cut off contact. I don't know where he is. Mark didn't respond right away, but when he did, there was something strange in his voice. He told me a few months ago that he was done with all of it, he said slowly, that he was tired of feeling like a wallet with legs. I thought he was just venting, but maybe he wasn't. My stomach twisted. Wallet with legs. Had Daniel really seen himself that way? Had he been planning this all along? Todd was watching me closely, arms crossed. Well, I hung up, rubbing my temple. Mark said Daniel was tired of being the wallet. Todd snorted. Oh, poor him. He had to financially support the daughter he abandoned. But something about Mark's words stuck with me. Daniel had always been careful about money. He didn't like spending on anything he deemed unnecessary. Had he felt trapped by Rachel's wedding? Had he resented us all so much that he'd rather vanish than pay for it? The thought sent a cold chill through me. That night, the first overdue invoice came in. It wasn't just the venue, the catering company, the florist, the band, even the dress boutique. Daniel had been the primary on all the contracts. He had made all the final payments. And now those payments were bouncing. One by one the invoices came pouring in, totaling nearly $110,000. It hit me like a freight train. Daniel hadn't just left. He had deliberately left us with a financial disaster. I stared at the invoices spread across the kitchen table, my hands trembling. Todd was pacing again, muttering angrily under his breath. We'll sue him. We'll track him down. He doesn't just get to run from this. But I wasn't sure we could. Daniel had made sure there was nothing left to take from him. His accounts were empty. His assets gone. Even his old house had been sold. I finally let out a hollow laugh, shaking my head. He did it. He actually did it. Todd stopped pacing. What? I looked up at him, something between disbelief and fury burning in my chest. He always told me that if I ever made him feel like he didn't matter, he'd walk away. And I guess he meant it. Todd frowned. You're seriously making excuses for him? I wasn't. But I was starting to understand. Daniel had been waiting for a reason to leave. And we had given him one. Rachel's wedding had been the final straw. We had ignored him, replaced him, pushed him to the background. And now we were paying for it, literally. Todd sighed, rubbing his forehead. So what do we do now? I exhaled slowly, pushing down the growing panic. We pay, I murmured. Because we don't have a choice. But as I stared at the mounting debt in front of me, one horrifying thought crept into my mind. What if this was only the beginning? I had spent my entire life believing that Daniel was a man incapable of real cruelty. He was distant, yes. Stubborn. Insufferably self-righteous. But cruel? No. Yet here I was, sitting in the middle of my kitchen, drowning in unpaid invoices, feeling the sharp edges of a betrayal I had never seen coming. Daniel wasn't just gone. He had taken everything. And the worst part? He had done it silently. No screaming match, no grand exit, no accusations hurled in anger. Just a quiet, calculated disappearance, like he was slipping out of a burning building while the rest of us stayed inside, completely unaware the fire was spreading. Todd stood by the counter, his arms crossed, staring at the bills with an expression that teetered between frustration and disbelief. So let me get this straight, he said slowly. Not only did Daniel leave, not only did he drain his accounts, but he left us to pay for everything? I nodded, pressing my fingers against my temples. It looks that way. Todd scoffed. Unbelievable. It was unbelievable. It had been nearly 2 decades since Daniel and I first stood at the altar, vowing to build a life together. Even after our love faded, even after the years chipped away at whatever bond we had left, I never thought he was capable of something like this. I had been wrong. Rachel still didn't know. I had debated whether to call her or wait until she got back from her honeymoon, but I knew it wasn't something I could hide. She had to hear it from me before someone else told her. I took a deep breath and dialed her number. She answered after 2 rings, her voice soft and happy. Hey, Mom. I hesitated. Hey, sweetheart. How's the honeymoon? Amazing, she sighed. Jason and I went snorkeling this morning, and we saw a sea turtle. It swam right up to us, I swear. I closed my eyes. I didn't want to ruin this for her. I didn't want to bring this chaos into her perfect little honeymoon bubble. But I had no choice. Rachel, my voice cracked. Something happened. A pause. What do you mean? I exhaled. It's about your father. Silence. Then carefully she asked, did he finally call you? I swallowed. No. He's gone, Rachel. Not just gone, he took everything. His accounts are closed. He left town. He canceled every payment for your wedding. For a moment, all I could hear was the sound of ocean waves crashing in the background. Then Rachel spoke, her voice eerily calm. You're joking. I shook my head, even though she couldn't see me. No. The venue called this morning. The payment bounced. Same with catering. The florist. The band. Everything. Rachel let out a short, bitter laugh. Unbelievable. I didn't say anything. Her breathing grew uneven. So what, you have to cover it? I hesitated. Yes. How much? I didn't want to say it. I didn't want to shatter whatever peace she had left. But I had no choice. Over 100,000, I whispered. The line went dead silent. Then in a voice filled with pure rage, Rachel hissed, that bastard. By the time I hung up the phone, my hands were shaking. Rachel had been furious, but not just at Daniel. She was furious at me. You trusted him, she had snapped. You let him be in charge of all the final payments. How could you be so stupid? I didn't have an answer. I had wanted to believe Daniel would do the right thing. That, despite everything, he would still take care of his daughter. That he would show up for her in the only way he could. But he hadn't. He had left her behind without a second thought. And now I was the one stuck picking up the pieces. Todd sat down beside me, watching as I ran a shaky hand through my hair. We'll figure it out, he said. I let out a humorless laugh. How? We don't have that kind of money lying around, Todd. We just spent a fortune on this wedding. And now we have to come up with another 100 grand. Todd hesitated. We have savings. I cut him off. For retirement, Todd. For emergencies. This is an emergency, he reminded me. I looked at him, something inside me twisting painfully. It shouldn't be our emergency. It should have been Daniel's. I wasn't ready to give up completely. Not yet. I spent the rest of the afternoon trying to track him down. I called old coworkers, former friends, even his damn barber. No one knew where he was. It was like he had vanished into thin air. But then just as I was about to give up, I got a text. Unknown number. Stop looking for me, Emily. I froze. My heartbeat slammed against my ribs. A second later, another message came through. Unknown number. You got what you wanted. A life without me in it. Now deal with it. I stared at the screen, my stomach twisting into knots. Todd leaned over my shoulder, reading the messages. His face darkened. It's him. I nodded, my hands numb. Todd exhaled sharply. What the hell does he mean? You got what you wanted? I swallowed. He thinks I pushed him out. Todd's jaw tightened. No. He walked away. But I wasn't so sure anymore. Because as I stared at those messages, a horrifying thought crept into my mind. Maybe Daniel had felt pushed out. Maybe we had ignored him too much, made him feel too insignificant. And maybe, just maybe, this was his revenge. I sat there, staring at Daniel's message, my fingers gripping the edge of the kitchen table so tightly my knuckles turned white. Stop looking for me, Emily. You got what you wanted. A life without me in it. Now deal with it. Todd was beside me, still reading over my shoulder, his breath coming in slow, controlled exhales. Controlled because I knew he wanted to explode. You've got to be kidding me, he muttered. He's blaming you for this? I didn't answer right away, because deep down I wondered if he was right. Not about leaving us with the bills, not about the sheer cruelty of what he'd done, but about feeling erased. Rachel had ignored him at her wedding. I had let it happen. We had pushed him to the background, made him feel replaceable. And instead of fighting back, instead of demanding his place, he had made a different choice. He had removed himself from our lives entirely. And now we were the ones left scrambling. Todd grabbed his own phone and started furiously typing. What are you doing? I asked. Calling a lawyer, he said sharply. If Daniel thinks he can just disappear and leave us holding the bag, he's out of his damn mind. I wanted to believe it would work. I wanted to believe there was a way to force Daniel to fix what he'd done. But the truth was there wasn't. By the end of the day, our worst fears were confirmed. Daniel had no assets left. No properties, no accounts, nothing. Everything had been liquidated, transferred, or erased in the weeks leading up to Rachel's wedding. He hadn't just left. He had made sure there was nothing left to take from him. He planned this, Todd muttered, shaking his head in disbelief. This wasn't some impulsive meltdown. This was calculated. I felt sick. Because he was right. Daniel had been planning this for months. The slow withdrawal from our lives. The subtle financial moves. Even the way he had barely argued when Rachel chose Todd over him. He had already decided. And now we were drowning because of it. I had barely processed the news before my phone rang again. Rachel. I hesitated before answering. Hey, sweetheart. Where is he? She snapped, skipping the pleasantries. I sighed, rubbing my forehead. I don't know. Rachel let out a bitter laugh. Of course you don't. Because he ran like a coward. Rachel. No, Mom. I don't care if he was upset. I don't care if he felt left out. He abandoned me. He abandoned us. And now, thanks to him, my honeymoon is officially ruined. I swallowed hard. Sweetheart, You should have seen this coming. She cut me off. You should have known he'd pull something like this. Her words stung. And the worst part? She was right. I should have known. The next morning I had no choice but to start dealing with the fallout. Todd and I dipped into our savings for the first installment on the venue. We had managed to negotiate a payment plan, but it still felt like a crushing weight. Every swipe of my credit card, every transfer from our account, felt like another knife in my chest. This was Daniel's mess. And we were the ones paying for it. I stared at the screen, watching the balance in our account shrink. And for the first time since this nightmare began, I felt something other than anger. I felt betrayed in a way that cut deeper than anything before. Because I had been married to this man. I had built a life with him. And now he had disappeared like we had never mattered. Like we had never even been real. That night, as Todd slept beside me, I found myself staring at my phone at the last message Daniel had sent. My fingers hovered over the keyboard. I wanted to scream at him. I wanted to ask him why. But instead I typed something else. How long were you planning this? I stared at the message for a long time. And then I deleted it. Because I already knew the answer. Long enough to make sure we couldn't stop him. The days after Daniel's disappearance blurred together in a haze of overdue invoices and desperate phone calls. Everywhere I turned, there was another reminder of his absence. Or worse, of what he had left behind. The bank statements. The notices from vendors. The quiet way Todd would sit at the dining room table at night, staring at the numbers, his jaw tight. Daniel was gone, but his shadow loomed over everything. And no matter how much I wanted to forget him, no matter how much I wanted to pretend he had never existed, I couldn't. Because every time I checked my account balance, every time Rachel called in a rage, every time Todd sighed heavily beside me, I felt it. The weight of him. Of the mess he had left for us to clean up. She came back from her honeymoon 3 days earlier than planned. I wasn't surprised. The moment she stepped through the front door, she dropped her bags and crossed her arms. Did you find him? I shook my head. No. Her expression darkened. You haven't tried hard enough. Rachel. No, Mom. Her voice was sharp, cutting through the air like a knife. You let this happen. You let him handle all the payments, you let him feel pushed out, and now we're the ones paying for it. I flinched. But she wasn't wrong. She brushed past me, muttering, I'll find him myself. I turned to watch her, my stomach twisting. And then what? She stopped. What? I stepped forward, lowering my voice. What do you think is going to happen if you find him, Rachel? Do you think he's just going to apologize and hand over the money? Do you think he cares? Her jaw clenched. I want him to face me. I sighed, shaking my head. He won't. She exhaled sharply, her hands trembling. I hate him. I believed her. But I also knew hatred didn't fix anything. It didn't bring the money back. It didn't undo the damage. And it didn't change the fact that Daniel had walked away without looking back. That night, Todd and I sat at the kitchen table, going through the latest financial statements. It wasn't just the wedding. Daniel had been paying for other things too. Rachel's rent, part of my car payments, even small things, a few utility bills, insurance. And now, all of it was suddenly our responsibility. Todd rubbed his forehead. This is worse than we thought. I swallowed hard. I know. His eyes flickered to me. Did you really have no idea he was planning this? I hesitated. And then softly I admitted. I ignored the signs. Because I had. Daniel had been pulling away for months. Years even. I had convinced myself it was just him being bitter, that he would never do something so extreme. But I had been wrong. And now we were paying the price. Todd sighed, leaning back in his chair. We're going to have to make some sacrifices. I nodded. I know. We both knew what that meant. Cutbacks. Selling things. Rearranging everything just to survive. Because Daniel had made sure there was no safety net. He had burned every bridge before walking away. And now we were left standing in the ashes. The next morning I got another call. Not from a vendor. Not from Rachel. But from our bank. The voice on the other end was polite, too polite. Mrs. Harmon, we wanted to inform you that a lien has been placed on your home, due to unpaid balances. I felt my stomach drop. A lien. I repeated, my throat tightening. Yes, the banker confirmed. It appears that Mr. Harmon had outstanding debts that were linked to your shared assets. Since his accounts are closed, the responsibility has now fallen to you. I gripped the edge of the counter, my nails digging into the wood. How much? I forced myself to ask. A pause. And then, $72,000. I couldn't breathe. Daniel hadn't just left us with wedding bills. He had left us financially ruined. And the worst part? We hadn't even seen the worst of it yet. The banker's voice faded into the background as I gripped the counter for support. A lien. On our home. $72,000. I opened my mouth to say something, anything, but the words wouldn't come. My heart pounded in my chest, my mind racing. Daniel had tied his debts to our house. And now that he was gone, the responsibility had fallen to me. Mrs. Harmon? The banker's voice was patient but firm. I swallowed hard. There has to be a mistake. I'm afraid not, she said gently. The debts were in both of your names. Since Mr. Harmon's accounts have been closed and liquidated, you are now the sole account holder. The lien was placed as collateral against the outstanding balances. My hands trembled. Collateral. That meant if I didn't come up with the money, they could take the house. I barely whispered. How long do I have to pay it? There was a pause, papers rustling on the other end. You have 90 days before further action is taken. 3 months. 3 months before I lost my home. 3 months before everything I had built with Todd crumbled. I don't remember ending the call. I barely remember making it to the kitchen table before my legs gave out beneath me. Todd walked in a second later, his brow furrowed. Emily. I couldn't even lift my head. They put a lien on the house, I whispered. Silence. Then Todd's voice, low, sharp. What? I squeezed my eyes shut. Daniel had debts. They were linked to our assets. Now that he's gone, it all falls on me. I felt Todd stiffen beside me. How much? I exhaled shakily. 72,000. A bitter laugh escaped him. Of course he did this. His chair scraped against the floor as he sat down heavily. He ran a hand down his face, exhaling slowly, like he was forcing himself to stay calm. "What do we do?" I whispered. Todd didn't answer right away. When he finally spoke, his voice was cold. "We sell." The next few days passed in a blur of desperation. We listed Todd's car for sale first. It wasn't necessary, not when we still had mine, but it felt like a punch to the gut watching him part with it. Then we started going through other assets. Jewelry. Electronics. Even a few heirlooms I had sworn I'd never sell. None of it added up to $72,000. And every night as Todd and I sat at the table, poring over our dwindling accounts, a familiar rage bubbled inside me. Daniel had done this. And he had walked away free. I checked my phone constantly, hoping for another message. Hoping that maybe he'd feel guilty enough to explain himself. But there was nothing. Rachel came over on Sunday, and the moment she stepped through the door, she knew. Her eyes darted to the stacks of papers on the table. The itemized lists of things we were selling. "What's going on?" she demanded. Todd and I exchanged glances before I exhaled. Daniel's debts were linked to the house. Rachel's face twisted. "What does that mean?" I swallowed. "It means if we don't come up with $72,000, we lose everything." Her hands curled into fists. "You mean he screwed us again?" Todd nodded stiffly. "Yeah." Rachel's expression darkened. "We need to find him." I shook my head. "There's nothing left to take from him, Rachel. Even if we did, what could we do?" Her voice trembled with fury. "I don't care. I want him to look me in the eye and explain how he could do this." I stared at my daughter. The same daughter who had ignored her father on her wedding day. The same daughter who had replaced him without a second thought. And suddenly something inside me snapped. "You want him to look you in the eye?" My voice was cold. "Why? So you can feel better." Rachel blinked. "Excuse me." I stood, slamming my hands against the table. "You ignored him, Rachel. You treated him like he didn't matter. And now you're surprised that he acted like he didn't." Rachel's face paled. "Mom." "No," I cut her off. "You didn't want him in your life. You made that clear. So he left. And now we're all paying for it." She stared at me, her hands shaking. "So you're saying this is my fault?" I exhaled sharply, rubbing my temples. "No. I'm saying we pushed him out." Rachel's voice cracked. "So he's the victim?" I hesitated, because I didn't know what Daniel was anymore. A victim? No. A monster? Maybe. But as I looked at my daughter, at the pain in her eyes, I realized something terrifying. She was just like him. Too proud to admit when she had gone too far. Too stubborn to acknowledge the damage she had done. And now for the first time I wondered, had she really lost her father? Or had she just thrown him away? That night Todd and I sat in the living room, exhaustion weighing us down. The house was quiet. Too quiet. Todd let out a breath. "We're going to get through this." I nodded, but I wasn't sure I believed it. Then, just as I was about to close my eyes, my phone buzzed. Unknown number. My breath hitched as I grabbed it, my fingers trembling as I opened the message. "You should have known this was coming. You made your choice." "So did I." My stomach twisted. Another message came through. "Sell the house, Emily. It was never really yours anyway." I stopped breathing. Because I knew in that moment Daniel hadn't just left. He had been waiting. Watching. And we were still playing right into his hands. The moment I read Daniel's message, the room tilted. Todd was still beside me on the couch, rubbing his temples, but I felt miles away, staring at the phone screen like it was a live wire. "You should have known this was coming. You made your choice." "So did I." "Sell the house, Emily. It was never really yours anyway." I read the words over and over, trying to make sense of them. He was watching. I knew it. Todd's voice pulled me back. "Emily? What is it?" I swallowed hard, my hands trembling as I turned the phone toward him. His eyes skimmed the message, and then he shot up from the couch, his entire body tensing. "That son of a..." Todd stormed toward the kitchen, already dialing. I barely managed to stand before he had the phone to his ear, pacing. His free hand clenched into a fist. "Yes, I need to trace a number," he snapped. "It's an emergency. No, I don't care if it's restricted. I need a location now." I flinched. Todd. He spun around, shaking his head. No. We are not letting him get away with this. I didn't argue, because for the first time I wasn't sure I wanted Daniel to stay gone. Todd spent hours trying to track the number, calling every tech contact he had, digging through databases, even hiring a private investigator. But Daniel had covered his tracks well. Every account, every trace of him had been wiped. Except for one thing. The bank transaction. I hadn't noticed it at first, not until Todd sat down exhausted, his eyes scanning through Daniel's old financial records one more time. And then suddenly he froze. What is it? I whispered. He turned the laptop toward me, his finger hovering over a single entry. A wire transfer. $500. Sent from Daniel's old account just before he closed it. The recipient? A small motel 3 states away. Todd exhaled sharply. He was staying there. I barely whispered. Do you think he still is? Todd grabbed his keys. We're about to find out. We left before dawn, the road stretching endlessly before us. Todd was silent, his grip tight on the wheel, the air in the car thick with tension. I stared out the window, my mind racing. What was I going to say to Daniel when I saw him? Would I scream? Would I beg? Would I even recognize him anymore? Because the man I had married wouldn't have done this. He wouldn't have left us in ruins. Would he? It was a dump. A run-down, barely standing roadside motel with flickering neon signs and cracked pavement. Todd pulled into the parking lot, his knuckles white as he cut the engine. I swallowed hard, scanning the lot. There were only a few cars, none that looked familiar. My stomach twisted. What if we were too late? Todd didn't wait, he climbed out, striding toward the front desk. I followed, my legs heavy, my heart pounding so hard I thought it might break through my ribs. The motel clerk barely looked up from his newspaper when we walked in. Todd pulled out his phone, showing the transaction. This was made a few weeks ago. A guest of yours. The man squinted, pushing his glasses up. You looking for someone? Todd's jaw tightened. Yeah. His name's Daniel Harmon. The man scratched his chin. Room 214. I stopped breathing. Todd turned to me. Let's go. We climbed the stairs, the carpet stained and musty beneath our feet. My hands trembled as Todd knocked on the door. Silence. Then movement. The sound of a lock clicking. And then the door opened. And there he was. Daniel. My husband. Or at least the ghost of him. For a moment none of us spoke. Daniel stood in the doorway, staring at us like we were ghosts, like he had never expected us to find him. And maybe he hadn't. Maybe in his mind we were already gone. But standing here now, looking at him, at the man who had once been my husband, I barely recognized him. He had lost weight. His face was sharper, his beard unkempt. His shirt was wrinkled, his jeans hung looser on his frame. But his eyes were the same. Cold. Distant. Unmoved. Todd was the first to speak, his voice low and seething. You bastard. Daniel exhaled through his nose, his fingers tightening around the doorframe. You shouldn't be here. I took a step forward, my voice trembling. You left us, Daniel. You left us with your debts, your mess. And now you're just hiding here. He didn't flinch. Instead, he looked me dead in the eye and said, I told you. You wanted a life without me. Now you have it. Something inside me snapped. You don't get to play the victim, I hissed. You didn't just leave. You made sure we'd suffer for it. Daniel's face remained unreadable. I did what I had to do. Todd lunged for him. I barely managed to grab his arm before he could swing, his body shaking with rage. Daniel didn't even blink. I should break your damn jaw, Todd growled. Daniel tilted his head. Would it change anything? Todd's breath came out in sharp exhales, his fists still clenched. You ruined her, Daniel. You ruined Rachel. She worshipped you once. And now? She hates you. For the first time, something flickered across Daniel's face. Regret? Pain? I couldn't tell. But it was gone just as fast. She made her choice, he said simply. She didn't need me. I stepped forward then, my voice shaking with fury. And what about me? I whispered. Did I deserve this? Daniel looked at me. Really looked at me. And then softly he said, You stopped being my wife a long time ago, Emily. I felt like I had been punched. My breath hitched, my chest tightening. Daniel took a slow step back into his motel room. Go home, Emily. There's nothing left to fix. He started to close the door. I slammed my hand against it before it could shut. And I did something I never thought I would do. I laughed. A cold, hollow laugh that made Daniel's brows furrow. You think you won, don't you? I whispered. Daniel said nothing. You think leaving us was some kind of revenge, I continued. That you took everything from us. That we're broken because of you. Still he didn't speak. So I leaned in, my voice dropping to a sharp, venomous whisper. You were never the most important thing in our lives, Daniel. Not really. For the first time I saw it, a crack in his composure. A flicker of something that almost looked like pain. Almost. But before he could say anything, I stepped back. Todd followed, shaking his head in disgust. We left him there, standing in the doorway of his miserable little motel room, watching us walk away. Just like he had once walked away from us. And as we reached the car, Todd muttered, That's it? We're just leaving. I exhaled, gripping the door handle. Yes, I whispered. Because there was nothing left to say. We had found Daniel. But in reality, we had lost him long before he ever left. And now we had to do what he never could. We had to move on. The end.